Hi, it's Janet Martin here, coming to you from the University of Western Ontario. The Medici Centre is the name of our unit. And I'm going to share with you today a little bit about hospital-based HTA in Canada, an overview, and also some opportunities for local and global networking. So our agenda for today is to talk about generally HTA in Canada, and then I'm going to share with you a little bit of our experience in London, Ontario, and then we'll ramp it up a little bit towards the end, towards talking about networking locally as well as across Canada, some of our plans, and then opportunities for networking internationally. I'm not going to really have time today to talk about what we're doing at the World Health Organization and internationally, but suffice it to say that there's lots of opportunities. So the center that I direct is called Medici, acronym for Medical Evidence, Decision Integrity, and Clinical Impact. We're really about getting the evidence synthesized objectively so that we can have an integral decision process that's objective and so that we can impact patient care and improve health system outcomes. And some of you will recognize us from the past as Epicor and High Tech, and of course we have provided the Know4Go framework for use around the world. So in Canada, we've got a different system than many other countries of the world. 34 million people. Healthcare is regulated federally, but it's administered provincially, and hospitals have their own decision-making frameworks. That's changing a little bit now, but basically hospitals have fixed budgets, or at least some fixation of their budgets, which is allocated by regions or by provinces. So a lot of decisions are made within those fixed limits at the hospital level. So in Canada, the question is always, do we really need to have a hospital-based HTA when we've got regulatory processes of review at Health Canada, and then we've got CADTH, which does a number of assessments of health technologies, and then we've also got the provincial agency and the arm's length agency called the Medical Advisory Secretariat, and the OTAC committee, which advises on health technologies for hospitals as well as beyond hospitals. And those processes are very helpful and essential. However, within the hospital setting, there are so many technology decisions that are made that are not actually informed by these particular processes, and certainly not in the timing at which the technology is knocking at the door of the hospital, either through research or through implementation into practice. And so what we have found is that HTA really is crucial at the local level. We have technological innovations that restructure our healthcare continuously in beneficial and maybe not some beneficial ways. It's quite unsettling. And the demand and potential for innovative technologies has outpaced our capacity to provide them. And these technologies are especially concentrated in the hospital setting. Innovations relevant to hospitals are often not assessed nationally or internationally, provincially, or even academically before those technologies are being used in the hospital, either investigationally or through other means. So we do have quite a lot of hospital-based HTA activity in Canada. We've got more than 5 units in Quebec, 2 or more in Ontario, 1 in Alberta, and then we also have a lot of other regional activities where regions are working together with hospitals or on behalf of them, maybe in a bit of an arm's length way. And so a number of you will recognize that the material that I'm presenting comes from our book, which many of you contributed to. Thank you very much. So we do have a book on hospital-based HTA that looks at 31 units around the world, 18 countries involved here, and including the 6 units from Canada that contributed chapters to the book. And you can actually find more detail there if you're interested in more information. So we know that there are some shortcomings of arm's length or out of hospital HTA produced by regional or national or international agencies. And it really comes down to the fact that even if you do a global assessment of the evidence, that global assessment really doesn't tell us what we should do locally, given our competing priorities and given what we've already put into practice, given our skills and our infrastructure, as well as our priorities within our hospital walls. And so we really need to have our own assessment at the local level. And this is not to say that we would ignore an assessment that is done at the regional or national or international level. That's great if it's already done, the global evidence assessment. We would actually use that as our jumping off point and then localize that for our unit. However, the more common situation is where we don't have an assessment that's been done, or it's not up to date enough, or not relevant in terms of the way the outcomes were assessed or the range of outcomes assessed. So we're often doing these on our own. And despite the fact that existing external HTAs do exist, hospitals generally are still making their decisions very passively, opportunistically, without coordination, not necessarily based on the best available evidence. Often experts have undue weight in decision making and are often advocating for the technologies that they would prefer, rather than an objective net benefit look at the benefits and risks. And sometimes these decisions are made primarily based on what the manufacturer provides, and often these decisions are made in camera by administrators without all of the stakeholders involved and without all of the evidence objectively at play in that particular decision. So we propose that we do need evidence-based, hospital-based health technology assessment, and by that we mean a rigorous assessment of the clinical and socioeconomic impact of drugs, devices, procedures, and programs of care by appropriately synthesizing all the available evidence, and the rigor of that evidence put in its place in terms of understanding the relevance as well as the importance and rigor of that evidence. So local HTA really does differ from arm's length HTA. When we're doing local hospital-based HTA, typically we're not only asking, can it work, but we also need to be reality-based and ask whether does it work in our setting, in our context, given what we've got. And we also need to take a look at whether or not it's worth it, given the trade-offs in our local center, given the competing priorities and competing technologies and skills and decisions that we have at play. And we also need to be, when we're making decisions about what technologies to implement, we also have to be very inclusive of all of our end users. And it's very difficult to do that if we don't have an internal process of health technology assessment and interactive as well as deliberative decision making with our end users and other stakeholders involved. Otherwise, the buy-in is really low if it comes from an external report only without contextualization. And we also have to be very quick. Decisions are made very quickly, and whether we like it or not. And so we have to be there with what's possible in terms of evidence-based reviews in time. And those decisions will not necessarily wait for external HTAs to be done. And we also find that we need to do these assessments that they're accountable to the predictions about what the evidence suggested will come to play with the implementation of that technology. So sometimes we can actually take a step-by-step process whereby we assess whether or not it should work given the best available evidence. Then we implement it for a time, evaluate, and see whether or not, in fact, the predictions came true. Did it work in our setting? If not, what's wrong, or should we actually give it up? And because we have the four walls of the hospital and the budgets, we can often sort of see these impacts very quickly, or at least more quickly than what we can at arm's length. So hospitals independently typically still decide which health technologies they will purchase within their available resources. So we need independent, scientific, rigorous, and defensible processes to do this. So I'm going to just now turn my focus a little bit to our local experience in London. So in London, we are actually a large hospital, over 600 beds, 42 operating rooms, and our budget is now over $1.6 billion at the hospital level. Now, what we find is that technology in our hospital, I'm sure it's true for you as well, enters the hospital often before it enters the market, and it does so through either special access or through research processes. And because of this, it's kind of special in that we need to understand that technology before the evidence has necessarily arisen. We also need to understand how to influence the research that is done so that it informs our ultimate decision whether or not to keep it and whether to pay for it and integrate it into practice. But even when there is good evidence about a technology, we find that technologies are not necessarily translated into practice predictably. And so we have this lost in translation problem whereby, technologies with low level of evidence are sometimes shunted into practice too soon, whereas those that don't or that do have adequate evidence are sometimes ignored for reasons that are not explained. So we have a framework whereby we in the hospital tend to take a look at these three key questions, at least broadly, when we're deciding about a technology. We need to decide, can it work in the ideal setting, giving the ideal evidence, and then contextualize that. Can it work here? And then actually, in reality, when we implement it, is it going to work given our limitations and our availabilities? And then, and we can also derive some of those predictions based on observational data from the real world setting before we contextualize it to our own setting. And then we have to ask, is it worth it? And if so, for which patient groups, in which setting? And then specifically, is it worth it here? So within the London Health Sciences Centre, we have done hospital-based HTA for a number of years in various ways and forms and fashions. And it's been a lot about doing and brokering and applying health technology assessment to decisions. So I'd like to give you a little bit of the history in terms of what we did initially and then where we've actually progressed to today. So basically, first what we tried to do was get the evidence straight. And thinking that a systematic review or an economic analysis would be enough in order to inform decisions and convince people about the validity or not of that particular technology. But what we found is that evidence alone and economic evaluations alone, not nearly enough. So evidence is a really important foundational consideration, but it shouldn't be the only consideration. What we found when we used that very typical linear evidence-based approach was that the tendency was to always vie for, yes, we should take this technology up into practice because there was always some sort of a benefit that could be proposed for at least one subset of our patient population. But obviously not every single technology should be put into practice. There are limits and there are other reasons for why, beyond what the published evidence provides, that we might make a decision for or against a technology. But based on our initial approach, very evidence-based and linear approach, we found that we had this technology hype cycle repeating itself, whereby a new technology comes out and there's always a lot of pressure to put that thing into practice and be the first teaching hospital to do so because new is better and we love new technologies, of course. But we typically found that our expectations were quite inflated based on a linear evidence-based approach alone, and sometimes put things into practice too soon, too fast, and found that our expectations were not met. And maybe we had adverse events because we didn't prepare well enough in terms of the other factors that needed to be addressed before we decide whether and how to put this into play. So we moved on beyond evidence only and took a broader approach, still having the foundational evidence-based approach, but we added to that. So now we know that evidence is essential, but alone is insufficient. So we moved to create a framework, and we created this framework iteratively over time, and it has changed over the years. But we found that, yes, we need to do the evidence synthesis and the cost effectiveness analysis, but we also need to take a look at the sleepers and the opportunity cost. Now you'll ask, what is a sleeper? Well, those are the expanded domains of influence on a decision that need to be addressed upfront and systematically before you put something into practice or decide whether to put it into practice. And those, the sleeper is an acronym for the social implications, the legal, ethical, environmental, and institutional implications, as well as the political factors, as well as the entrepreneurial and research innovation factors, as well as the stickiness and sustainability factors. So each of these domains actually needs to be proactively assessed in terms of our context before we decide whether or not this technology really can and should be put into place, and whether we need to actually organize ourselves and address these particular barriers or facilitators in order to safely put this new technology into practice. And we actually do this sleepers assessment in a formal way, whereby we have the stakeholders around the table at the time we're first considering a new technology. And we ask them to rate these sleepers, the social, legal, ethical, environmental implications, the political implications, the innovation value, as well as the research sufficiency and research opportunities, as well as the stickiness and sustainability issues. And we get the stakeholders to explain what they mean by these domains and how they think it should weigh into this particular decision relative to the evidence base and the resource implications. And we get clinicians to do this separately from administrators and managers. So you can see here as an example where we have clinicians rating the different domains in blue, and the administrators rating the different domains in orange. And this gives us a chance then upfront to see how different the perspectives are across these different domains in terms of their importance, and even what those domains, how you define what is important within those domains, gives us a chance to deliberate around those issues proactively, see whether there's evidence that addresses those particular domains, and or whether we need to contextually within our setting address them in order to either address barriers or facilitators. We also found that we need to go beyond taking a look at the evidence, economics, and the sleepers, and take consideration of the true cost. Now, cost really is the sacrifice of the consequences and the next best alternative use of resources. So the idea is that whenever we take up a new technology into our hospital, every decision to take up a new technology is actually a decision not to do something else. So a dollar spent here is a dollar that cannot be spent over there. And so we need to take into consideration this opportunity cost. So we call this framework Know for Go because we feel that you need to be able to know about these four domains: evidence, economics, sleepers, as well as opportunity cost, before you can decide whether or not a decision should be know these four domains and go, or whether it should be a no-go decision. And that needs to be done formally for all major technology decisions. So what does this look like? Well, we actually created a Know for Go trade-off table whereby we take a look at the budget impact and as well as the benefit index, and we contextualize that exactly to our predicted patient population as well as our resource implications. And we know that we can actually plot things on this particular table, technology decisions one at a time, based on the intersection of budget impact versus benefit index. And so the typical situation is that we'll plot our different options on this particular table if we're making technology decisions. The blue is a consideration where you've got a technology which is going to cost a lot but has no proven net benefit or risk. The green is no net budget impact and no net benefit index impact. The red is probably the most typical situation whereby we know it's going to cost an increment, but we also know that there's likely to be an incremental benefit. So we reserve white balls for things that are not yet taken up into practice. So you can imagine as we populate this particular trade-off table over time, that decisions, as we plot them on this particular table, based on their budget impact versus benefit index, we can put decisions into context. So decisions that we've made in the past are colored, and decisions that are live and active today are in gray or black, and decisions and opportunity costs are things that we know have some benefit and should be considered but have not yet been put into practice in our setting are the white balls such as A, D, and E. And we also know that in our hospital, there's some sort of no-go line out there above which we're not generally putting things into practice, where the budget impact is very large, but the benefit index expected is very low. So things below the go-no-go line are typically in practice, and things above it are typically should be out of practice and represent our disinvestment agenda. So if we were deciding on technology B and C today, we could see that given the evidence base, there's no predicted net benefit. The only thing that's sure is that there would be a huge budget impact. So we've got to decide whether or not to put those into practice and to take them up into practice. Because if we do, we know that there is a tangible and calculable opportunity cost calculated through A plus D plus E, which are technologies which we have not yet put into practice, which are real opportunity costs with real outcomes in terms of lives saved, quality adjusted life years gained, or surgeries prevented, etc. In the case of E, it would actually be a technology that we could put into practice and release resources back into the system to take up other things below the go-no-go line. So this has actually made it very transparent for our decision makers and makes it into a bit of a trade-off game, like a trade-off table, makes the opportunity cost very tangible, and causes us to have those very difficult conversations about whether or not we should put B and C into practice. Yes, there's lots of uncertainties in terms of the evidence base, but it becomes much more clear when we consider that we really are giving up A plus D plus E, which have proven tangible benefits based on the evidence base. The last thing we do is we take a look at those sleepers indicated here by price tags and whether or not the sleeper factors themselves outweigh the opportunity cost of A plus D plus E in terms of other social, legal, ethical, political factors which might weigh into the particular decision for B and C that we're looking at today. So we have found that this is a very collaborative approach to putting evidence and economics and everything else in its place, making it very transparent, brings in multiple perspectives across our practitioners, policymakers, causes us to talk about these things in the same way. And it also allows us to be multi-criteria, evidence and economics being our foundation, and the sleepers and the opportunity cost then being very tangibly also implicated in the decision making. Also ensures that evidence and economics don't unfairly trump our decision, given the social, legal, ethical implications which might not have been brought forth in the evidence base itself. Of course, it's very transparent and sometimes uncomfortably so, but this does actually overall tend to reduce our decisional conflicts or perceived decisional conflicts. And the idea is with this trade-off table that the decisions are always live. They're not a single event. And because the evidence changes and the economic and the resource implications change, and so do the sleepers, so the opportunity costs also change and competing alternatives. The idea is that we update this table as time goes on, as the evidence changes, as new opportunities arrive. So what might be a no today could become a yes in the future. And of course, it's contextual because it's embedding our decisions in an accountability framework so that we're accountable to decisions in terms of where the go-no-go line is. And we put our upcoming decisions in that context as well. So with this particular approach, when we took a look at the implications on the budget, we actually found that it did, in a time series analysis, reduce overall cost related to the technologies or the drugs that we were evaluating. So I'm just going to pause here, and if we have time, we'll take a look at the cases as well.